I adjusted the strap of my duffel bag and checked the slip of paper in my pocket one more time. Pier 7, Berth C. The salty air mixed with diesel fumes hit me as I walked down the weathered planks, scanning the boats moored along the dock. Commercial fishing vessels lined the pier in various states of repair, their masts and rigging creating a forest of metal and rope against the gray Oregon morning. The Cassandra's Dream looked solid enough, a 60-foot fishing boat with peeling white paint and rust stains bleeding down from the anchor chains. I'd answered the Craigslist ad 3 days ago, and Captain Torres had called me back within hours. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes. He asked if I had experience with physical labor, if I got seasick, and if I could follow instructions without asking questions. When I said yes to all three, he told me to show up at 7 a.m. sharp with gear for 2 weeks at sea. Now, standing on the dock with my bag slung over my shoulder, I wondered what I'd gotten myself into. Commercial fishing wasn't exactly my career plan, but the job paid better than anything else I could find with my complete lack of maritime experience. Plus, 2 weeks away from everything sounded pretty good right about then. "You, Mitchell?" I turned to see a man in his 50s approaching from the boat's deck. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working in salt spray and weather, with deep lines around his eyes and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. This had to be Captain Samuel Torres. "That's me, Tyler Mitchell." He looked me up and down, taking in my new work boots and the duffel bag that still had tags on the zippers. "First time on a fishing boat?" "Yes, sir." "Figured as much." He gestured toward the gangplank. "Come aboard. We'll get you sorted out." I followed him onto the deck, where 4 other crew members were busy with various tasks. 2 were checking nets near the stern. A woman with short dark hair, and a guy who looked like he could be her brother. Another woman with sun-bleached hair was coiling rope with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from years of repetition. A 4th crew member, a man in his 30s, was securing equipment near the wheelhouse. Captain Torres didn't bother with introductions yet. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The paper looked like it had been handled plenty of times, with worn creases and slightly faded ink. "Before we do anything else, you need to read this." He handed me the paper. "These are the rules for working on my boat. 6 of them. Simple enough that even a greenhorn can remember them." I unfolded the paper and immediately noticed the handwriting, careful block letters written in blue ink like someone had taken their time to make sure every word was legible. The paper itself felt heavier than normal notebook paper, almost like parchment. Rules for crew. 1. If you hear your name called from the water, do not respond and do not look toward the sound. Turn your back and walk away immediately. 2. If you hear a bell ringing that no one else seems to notice, find Riley Stevens and stay close to her until morning. 3. Never go below deck alone after sunset. 4. If you see 2 ships when there should be 1, report only the first ship. 5. Do not look at your reflection in the water for more than a few seconds. Do not respond if it waves or speaks. 6. During storms, follow all orders from the captain without question, even if they seem to make no sense. I read through the list twice, waiting for the punchline. When I looked up, Captain Torres was watching me with an expression that suggested he wasn't joking around. The other crew members had stopped what they were doing and were glancing in our direction with looks that made my stomach tighten. "Is this some kind of hazing thing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Like initiation for the new guy?" The woman coiling rope, who I assumed was Riley Stevens based on rule number 2, let out a short laugh that didn't sound amused. The 2 crew members by the nets exchanged a look that made me feel like I'd just said something inappropriate at a funeral. Captain Torres folded his arms. "Do I look like someone who has time for games, Mitchell?" I studied his face and realized he definitely didn't. The man radiated the kind of authority that came from years of making life-or-death decisions at sea. Still, the rules seemed like something out of a horror movie, not a legitimate workplace safety manual. I guess not, sir, but these rules are— I gestured at the paper. They're pretty unusual. Unusual doesn't mean optional. He nodded toward the crew. Everyone on this boat follows those rules, no exceptions. James Campbell. He pointed to the man by the wheelhouse. Riley Stevens, the woman with the rope. Kevin and Emily Baker, the pair by the nets. Each crew member gave me a nod as they were introduced, but their expressions remained serious. No welcoming smiles or casual banter. Just the kind of professional acknowledgement you'd expect from people who'd seen enough to know that some things shouldn't be taken lightly. You can ask them about it later if you want, Captain Torres continued. But right now I need to know if you're going to follow these rules or if you need to find yourself another boat. The smart thing would have been to ask more questions. The logical thing would have been to demand an explanation for why I needed to avoid looking at my reflection or responding to voices from the water. But I needed this job, and Captain Torres didn't seem like the type who appreciated philosophical discussions about workplace policies. I'll follow the rules, I said. Good. He took the paper back and folded it carefully before putting it in his pocket. James will show you where to stow your gear and explain the daily routine. We're casting off in 20 minutes. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. James gave me a quick tour of the boat. Galley, crew quarters, engine room, storage areas for equipment and supplies. The sleeping arrangements were tight but functional. 6 narrow bunks in a cabin that smelled like diesel fuel and old rope. My bunk was a middle one, wedged between Kevin and James. Food's pretty basic, James explained as we walked through the galley. Emily does most of the cooking and she's decent at it. Coffee's always on, and you'll want plenty of it during night shifts. He showed me how the various equipment worked. Winches, nets, sorting tables, communication gear. Everything looked well maintained but worn from constant use. The boat felt solid under my feet as we moved through the harbor, but I could already sense the different motion that would come once we hit open water. How long have you been working for Captain Torres? I asked as James demonstrated the proper way to secure the nets. 4 years. He checked the knots I'd tied and redid 2 of them. Good captain. Takes safety seriously. Those rules he gave me, I started. James looked up from the rope he was adjusting. What about them? They seem pretty specific, like someone had particular reasons for writing them. Reasons get developed over time. He finished with the net and moved to check another piece of equipment. Best thing you can do is pay attention to what the captain tells you and don't overthink things. The conversation felt like it was being steered away from the topic, but I didn't push. James had the kind of demeanor that suggested he'd seen enough to know when questions should be left alone. By late afternoon, we'd cleared the harbor and were heading out into the Pacific. The coastline gradually faded behind us until all I could see in any direction was water. The motion of the boat changed from the gentle rocking of the harbor to the longer, more pronounced swells of the open ocean. I spent the rest of the day learning the routine, checking equipment, organizing supplies, helping with whatever needed to be done. The crew worked with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of practice, and I tried to stay out of their way while still being useful. Riley turned out to be more talkative than James, but not by much. She answered my questions about procedures and safety protocols, but didn't volunteer any personal information. Kevin and Emily seemed friendly enough, but they kept their conversations focused on work-related topics. As evening approached, Captain Torres gathered everyone in the galley for dinner. Emily had made a fish stew that was better than I'd expected, and the crew gradually relaxed into more casual conversation. They talked about weather conditions, fishing reports from other boats, and plans for the next few days. I noticed that none of them mentioned the rules. After dinner, James assigned me to cleaning duty on the main deck while the others handled various tasks below. The sun had set while we were eating, leaving the boat surrounded by darkness broken only by our running lights and the occasional distant glow of other vessels. I worked my way around the deck, cleaning equipment and coiling rope according to the patterns James had shown me. The work was meditative in a way, repetitive tasks that let my mind wander while my hands stayed busy. The ocean stretched out in all directions, vast and black under the starry sky. I was wiping down the sorting tables when I heard it. Tyler. The voice came from somewhere off the port side, carried clearly across the water. It sounded familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. Female, with a tone that suggested urgency or distress. Tyler, please, I need help. I moved toward the rail, drawn by the voice and the way it seemed to know my name. The sound was coming from the water, maybe 50 feet from the boat. In the darkness, I couldn't see anything, but the voice continued. Tyler, I'm hurt. Please, I can't swim much longer. My hand was already reaching for the spotlight when rule number 1 crashed back into my consciousness. If you hear your name called from the water, do not respond and do not look toward the sound. Turn your back and walk away immediately. The voice came again, more insistent now. Tyler, why won't you help me? I know you can hear me. Every instinct told me to turn on the light, to look for whoever was in the water, to call for the captain. People didn't just float around in the middle of the ocean calling for help, but Captain Torres had made it clear that the rules weren't suggestions, and something about the way the crew had reacted earlier made me think there might be consequences for ignoring them. Please, Tyler, I'm so cold. The water's so cold. I forced myself to turn around, putting my back to the voice. My hands shook as I gathered up the cleaning supplies, trying to focus on the simple task of putting everything away properly. Tyler, don't leave me. You're just like all the others. You don't care if I die out here. The voice was getting angry now, but I kept walking toward the wheelhouse. Behind me, I heard a sound like something large hitting the water. Not a splash, but more like a massive weight being dropped from a height. Then came the shriek. It wasn't human. Nothing human could make a sound like that. A combination of rage and hunger that seemed to come from something with a throat, not designed for making noise. The sound cut through the night air and seemed to vibrate through the hull of the boat. I dropped the cleaning supplies and ran for the crew quarters, not caring how it looked or what anyone might think. My heart hammered against my ribs as I made it down the ladder and into the narrow hallway below deck. James was sitting on his bunk, reading a paperback novel. He looked up when I stumbled into the room, taking in my expression and the way my hands were still shaking. Heard something outside, did you? He asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. Good thing you remembered the rules. He went back to his book. Gets easier after the first few times. I sat down on my own bunk, still processing what had just happened. The voice had sounded so real, so desperate. But that shriek, that definitely hadn't come from any person in distress. James? I said after a few minutes. Yeah? Those rules. They're not really about hazing, are they? He looked up from his book again, and for the first time since I'd met him, his expression seemed almost sympathetic. No, Tyler. They're not about hazing. I lay down on my bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the boat moving through the water. Somewhere above, I could hear the crew going about their evening routines. But nobody mentioned anything about voices or shrieks or whatever had been in the water. Maybe they hadn't heard it. Maybe it was something that only happened to the new guy. Or maybe they'd all learned to ignore it the same way I'd just started to learn. Either way, I had a feeling this was going to be a very different kind of job than I'd expected. I woke to the sound of footsteps above and the low rumble of the engine beneath my bunk. Pale morning light filtered through the small porthole, and I could hear the crew already moving around on deck. James was lacing up his work boots on the bunk across from me. Kevin had already cleared out, probably up top, helping with whatever morning routine these guys followed. The cramped quarters felt different in daylight, less claustrophobic, more like a functional workspace designed for people who knew how to live in small spaces. James, I said, sitting up and running a hand through my hair. About last night. Coffee's ready in the galley, he interrupted, not looking up from his boots. Emily made breakfast too. You'll want to eat before we start working the nets. I tried again. That thing I heard calling my name. You said it gets easier after the first few times. What did you mean by Tyler? James stood up and gave me a look that was part warning, part sympathy. Some conversations are better left for port. Out here, we focus on the work and we follow the rules. That's how everyone stays safe. He headed for the ladder without another word, leaving me alone in the crew quarters. The message was clear enough. Whatever was happening on this boat, the veteran crew members weren't eager to discuss it while we were still at sea. I got dressed and made my way to the galley where Emily had indeed prepared breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. The crew ate efficiently, discussing the day's plans and weather conditions. Nobody mentioned voices or shrieks or anything that couldn't be found in a standard fishing manual. After breakfast, Captain Torres assigned me to deck maintenance while the others prepared the nets for the day's fishing. Coiling rope turned out to be more complicated than it looked. There were specific patterns that prevented tangling, and James had to show me 3 times before I got it right. Keep the coils even, Riley called out from where she was checking equipment near the stern. Tangled rope can get someone killed if you need it in a hurry. I worked my way around the deck, learning the rhythm of keeping everything organized and secure. The ocean stretched out in all directions under a gray sky, and other fishing boats were visible as distant specks on the horizon. Everything seemed normal. Just another day of commercial fishing on the Pacific. Then I heard the bell. It started as a distant ringing, like a church bell carried on the wind. At first I thought it might be coming from another boat, but the sound seemed to be originating from somewhere on our own vessel. I paused in my rope work and looked around, expecting to see one of the crew members reacting to the noise. Nobody else seemed to notice anything. James continued securing a net. Kevin and Emily worked side by side at the sorting station. Riley checked her equipment without any change in expression. The bell kept ringing, not loud but clear and persistent, like someone was methodically pulling a rope in a bell tower. Rule number 2 crashed back into my mind. If you hear a bell ringing that no one else seems to notice, find Riley Stevens and stay close to her until morning. I set down the rope I'd been coiling and walked over to where Riley was working. She looked up as I approached, and I saw her expression change when she took in whatever she saw on my face. "Riley," I said quietly, "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Do you hear that bell ringing?" The color drained from her face so quickly that for a moment I thought she might pass out. She glanced around the deck, taking in the other crew members who were continuing their work as if nothing was happening. "How long have you been hearing it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe 2 minutes. It's coming from somewhere on the boat, but nobody else seems to—" "Stay close to me," she interrupted, reaching out to grab my arm. "Don't go anywhere alone until tonight's over." The bell continued ringing for another minute, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. Riley didn't let go of my arm, and I noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. "Riley, what does it mean when—" "Not now," she said, glancing toward the wheelhouse where Captain Torres was visible through the windows. "Just stay close. We'll talk later." For the rest of the day, Riley found reasons to work near whatever task I was assigned to. When I helped Kevin with the nets, she repositioned herself to stay within sight. When James sent me to clean equipment on the other side of the deck, Riley followed with her own work. She never let me get more than a few yards away, and whenever I tried to ask about the bell, she just shook her head and changed the subject. The other crew members didn't comment on Riley's sudden protective behavior, which told me they probably understood what was happening, even if they hadn't heard the bell themselves. James gave me a few meaningful looks throughout the afternoon, and I remembered his warning about taking the rules seriously. By evening, I was exhausted from the day's work and the constant tension of knowing something was wrong without understanding what. Emily served dinner, fried fish and potatoes, and the crew settled into their usual casual conversation about weather and fishing conditions. Riley sat next to me at the small table, still maintaining her careful watch. After dinner, the crew dispersed to handle various evening tasks. Kevin and Emily mentioned something about playing cards in the galley, while James headed to his bunk with another paperback novel. Riley started cleaning dishes, keeping one eye on me the entire time. "I'm going to check on something below deck," I told her, testing to see what would happen. "No," she said immediately. "Whatever you need can wait until morning." Rule number 3, never go below deck alone after sunset. But curiosity had been eating at me all day. The bell, Riley's reaction, the way everyone seemed to know things they weren't willing to explain. I needed to understand what was really happening on this boat. And despite everything I'd already experienced, part of me still wondered if there might be rational explanations for what seemed like supernatural events. I waited until Riley got distracted organizing supplies, then slipped away from the galley and headed for the ladder that led to the lower decks. The crew quarters were empty, with James's bunk light still on, but no sign of him. I could hear voices from the galley above, Kevin and Emily talking about their card game. The hallway below deck felt different at night. The overhead lights created pools of harsh white illumination separated by stretches of deep shadow, and the familiar spaces seemed to have shifted somehow. The walls appeared closer together, and the ceiling felt lower than I remembered from the day before. I made my way toward the engine room, telling myself I just wanted to check on the equipment and prove that everything was normal. But as I walked through the narrow corridor, I started hearing voices, whispered conversations in languages that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. The words seemed to come from the walls themselves, too quiet to understand, but constant enough to be unsettling. The shadows moved wrong, too. Not the normal shifting that happens when a boat rocks on the water, but deliberate movements that seemed independent of any light source. I caught glimpses of shapes in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I turned to look directly at them. The engine room door was slightly open, which I didn't remember from my earlier tour with James. I pushed it wider and stepped inside, where the familiar rumble of the diesel engine should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. That's when I saw her. Emily was standing in the far corner of the engine room, perfectly motionless with her back to me. She wore the same clothes she'd had on during dinner, but something about her posture seemed wrong. Too rigid, like a mannequin positioned by someone who didn't understand how human bodies naturally stood. "Emily?" I called out. "Everything okay?" She didn't respond or turn around, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. I took a step closer, and that's when I caught sight of her reflection in the polished metal surface of the engine housing. What looked back at me wasn't Emily, or wasn't entirely Emily. The reflection showed a figure with too many arms, limbs that bent at joints that shouldn't exist, and a face that shifted between human features and something else entirely. I stumbled backward, knocking into a tool rack that clattered loudly in the confined space. The figure in the corner still didn't move, but the reflection in the metal turned its head toward me with a motion that was too quick and too fluid to be natural. I ran. My feet pounded up the ladder and across the deck faster than I'd ever moved in my life. Behind me, I could hear sounds from below. Not footsteps, but something like heavy objects being dragged across metal surfaces. By the time I reached the galley, my heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. Kevin and Emily were sitting at the small table, playing cards just as they'd mentioned. Emily looked up when I burst through the door, taking in my expression and the way I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon. "You okay?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I stared at her, taking in her relaxed posture, the cards in her hands, and the way she was clearly exactly where she'd been for the past hour. Kevin nodded at me and went back to studying his hand, completely unconcerned by my dramatic entrance. "Yeah," I managed to say. "I'm fine. Just thought I forgot something below deck." Emily smiled and turned back to her cards. "Well, you found us instead. Want to join the next hand?" I shook my head and mumbled something about being tired. Riley appeared in the doorway behind me, and the look she gave me made it clear she knew exactly what had happened. "Come on," she said quietly. "Let's get some air on deck." As we walked outside, I could hear Emily and Kevin continuing their game, their voices carrying the easy familiarity of people who'd spent years working together. Whatever I'd seen in the engine room, it definitely hadn't been the real Emily. Riley and I stood at the rail for a long time that night, neither of us saying much about what had happened below deck. She asked a few quiet questions, how long I'd been down there, what exactly I'd seen, whether the figure had noticed me. But mostly we just watched the dark water and listened to the normal sounds of the boat cutting through the swells. Eventually, exhaustion won out over adrenaline, and I made my way back to the crew quarters. James was still reading in his bunk, and he looked up when I came down the ladder. "Everything good?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "Gets easier," he said, echoing what he'd told me the night before. "You're learning." I fell asleep to the familiar rumble of the engine and the sound of water against the hull, trying not to think about reflections that moved wrong or figures that stood too still in dark corners. Morning came with Kevin shaking my shoulder and telling me I had watch duty. The sun was just starting to climb above the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gray and pale gold. Most of the crew was still asleep, and the boat felt peaceful in the way that only early morning at sea can manage. I climbed to the wheelhouse where Captain Samuel was reviewing charts and drinking coffee from a metal thermos. He glanced up when I entered, taking in my appearance with the kind of assessment that had become familiar over the past few days. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Well enough." "Good. Keep an eye on the horizon while I check our position. Holler if you see anything that needs attention." I took up position at the front windows and scanned the water in all directions. A few fishing boats were visible as distant specks, and the coastline was a thin line far to the east. The ocean stretched out under a mostly clear sky, looking deceptively normal after everything I'd experienced. That's when I spotted the ships. Two vessels were moving in parallel formation about 3 miles off our starboard side. The first was clearly a cargo ship, big, boxy, with the distinctive profile of a container vessel heading north along the shipping lanes. Nothing unusual about that. The second ship made my blood turn cold. It looked exactly like the Cassandra's Dream. Same length, same white paint with rust stains, same configuration of masts and rigging. Even from this distance, I could make out details that should have been impossible to see. The same equipment layout, the same wear patterns on the deck, the same slight list to port that our boat had developed over years of use. I blinked hard and looked again, thinking it might be some kind of optical illusion or my brain playing tricks after a few days of strange experiences. But the duplicate remained, moving at the exact same speed and heading as the cargo ship beside it. Rule number 4 came back to me with crystal clarity. If you see 2 ships when there should be one, report only the first ship. "Captain," I called out, not taking my eyes off the horizon. "There's a cargo vessel bearing north-northeast, maybe 3 miles out." Captain Samuel moved to stand beside me, following my line of sight. I watched his face carefully as he studied the water, looking for any reaction that might tell me whether he could see what I was seeing. "Good eyes," he said after a moment. "Anything else?" "No, sir. Just the one ship." He nodded approvingly, and something in his expression confirmed that he knew exactly what I wasn't reporting. The way his shoulders relaxed slightly, the brief look of satisfaction that crossed his face. Captain Samuel was well aware that there were 2 vessels out there, and he was pleased that I'd followed the rule correctly. We watched the ships continue their parallel course until they disappeared beyond the northern horizon. The cargo vessel looked normal throughout the entire sighting, but the duplicate never wavered from its perfect mimicry of our own boat. Even as it vanished into the distance, I had the uncomfortable feeling that whoever or whatever was aboard that second vessel had been watching us just as intently as we'd been watching them. "I'll take the watch back now," Captain Samuel said eventually. Go get some breakfast. Emily made pancakes. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I helped James with equipment maintenance, learned a few more knots from Riley, and tried to stay useful without getting in anyone's way. The crew seemed more relaxed than they had the previous day, and I wondered if successfully following another rule had somehow improved my standing with them. By afternoon, we'd deployed the nets and were working to bring in the day's catch. The process involved a lot of coordination between crew members, with everyone taking turns at different stations as the nets came up. Kevin and Emily worked the winch controls, while James and Riley guided the nets over the rail. I was assigned to check the rigging and make sure nothing got tangled during the operation. That meant spending time leaning over the side of the boat, inspecting the lines where they entered the water and watching for any problems that might damage the equipment. The ocean was unusually calm, creating a mirror-like surface that reflected the afternoon sky with perfect clarity. I was checking a section of rope near the stern when I made the mistake of looking down at my reflection. The face that looked back at me was mine, but wrong in ways that made my stomach clench. The reflection grinned with a smile that stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and numerous like those of a deep-sea predator. Its eyes held an intelligence that felt ancient and hungry, and when it raised its hand to wave, I could see that its fingers were impossibly long with joints that bent at unnatural angles. The reflection's mouth moved, forming words that I couldn't hear but somehow understood anyway. Threats spoken in my own voice, promises of what would happen if I fell into the water, descriptions of the cold darkness that waited beneath the surface. Rule number 5 crashed through my panic. Do not look at your reflection in the water for more than a few seconds. Do not respond if it waves or speaks. I forced myself to back away from the rail, fighting every instinct that wanted to keep staring at the impossible thing wearing my face. The reflection's grin widened even further as I retreated, and it raised both hands to wave with movements that looked like a grotesque parody of friendliness. Behind me, I heard splashing sounds, not the normal noise of water against the hull, but deliberate movements like someone swimming nearby. Then came my own voice, calling from the ocean, using words I'd never spoken but which carried the unmistakable cadence of my speech patterns. "Tyler," the voice called. "Tyler, come back. I want to show you something." I kept walking toward the wheelhouse, refusing to turn around despite the way the voice grew more insistent. It knew things about me, childhood memories, fears I'd never shared with anyone, the exact tone I used when I was angry or frightened. But underneath the familiar sound was something else, a quality that no human throat could produce. "Tyler, don't be rude. I'm talking to you." I made it to the wheelhouse and leaned against the metal structure, focusing on the solid reality of painted steel and trying to block out the voice that continued calling from the water. My hands shook as I gripped the railing, and I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cool ocean air. Eventually, the voice stopped. The splashing sounds faded away. When I finally worked up the courage to glance back toward the stern, the water looked normal again, just the familiar wake of the boat and the nets trailing behind us in the current. Kevin found me there 20 minutes later, still leaning against the wheelhouse and trying to process what had happened. He took one look at my face and nodded like he understood exactly what I'd been through. Without saying a word, he disappeared into the galley and returned with a cup of coffee, still warm, with the kind of strong brew that Emily made for the crew during long shifts. He handed it to me and stood nearby while I drank it, not asking questions or trying to start a conversation. The coffee helped. The warmth spread through my chest and hands, chasing away the chill that had settled into my bones. Kevin's presence helped too, steady and reassuring in the way that came from someone who'd faced similar experiences and learned to move past them. "Thanks," I said when I'd finished the coffee. Kevin just nodded and headed back to help the others with the nets. The afternoon continued with its routine of hauling in fish, sorting the catch, and preparing for the evening meal. Nobody mentioned reflections or voices from the water. but I noticed that Riley kept an eye on me for the rest of the day, and James made sure I stayed busy with tasks that kept me away from the rail. The rules were starting to make sense in a way I wished they didn't. Each one addressed a specific threat, and the crew's matter-of-fact approach to following them suggested these weren't isolated incidents, but regular challenges of working this far from shore. Whatever was happening on the Cassandra's Dream, it was something that experienced fishermen had learned to navigate through careful adherence to guidelines developed by people who'd faced these dangers before. I was learning to be one of those people, whether I'd planned on it or not. The next evening brought a change in the weather that seemed to settle into my bones before I could see it on the horizon. The air pressure shifted in a way that made my ears pop, and the usually steady rhythm of the waves took on an irregular pattern that had the crew moving with more purpose than usual. I was helping Kevin secure equipment when Captain Samuel's voice carried across the deck from the wheelhouse, not shouting, but with an edge that made everyone stop what they were doing and look up. "Storm coming in," he called out. "Different kind of storm. Everyone to the galley in 5 minutes." The clouds were still just a dark smudge on the western horizon, but James was already moving to double-check the nets, and Riley had started gathering loose items that might become projectiles in heavy seas. Emily and Kevin worked together to secure the sorting station, their movements quick and efficient. I'd been through storms before on land, and I'd imagined that a storm at sea would just mean bigger waves and more rain. But the way the crew moved told me this was something else entirely. There was a tension in their actions that went beyond normal storm preparation, a carefulness that reminded me of how they'd acted before each supernatural encounter I'd witnessed. In the galley, Captain Samuel stood with his back to the small window, his weathered face more serious than I'd seen it since my first day aboard. The crew gathered around the table, but nobody sat down. The boat's motion had changed too, rolling in a way that felt different from the usual ocean swells. "Listen carefully," Samuel said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the confined space. "The storm that's coming isn't going to follow normal patterns. I need you to follow my orders exactly, even if they don't make sense to you, especially if they don't make sense." Rain began pattering against the galley windows, light at first, but building quickly into a steady drumming. Through the glass, I could see the horizon had disappeared into a wall of gray that was moving toward us faster than seemed possible. "First rule for tonight," Samuel continued. "Nobody speaks above a whisper from now until dawn. I don't care if you have to shout to be heard over the wind. You whisper or you stay quiet." James nodded, and I saw him mouth something to Riley that I couldn't catch. The crew's acceptance of this bizarre instruction reminded me of rule number 6. Follow all storm orders without question, regardless of how little sense they make. "Second," Samuel said, "you stay within arm's reach of each other at all times. If someone has to move, you move together. Nobody works alone, nobody goes anywhere alone, nobody even takes a piss alone." Kevin glanced at Emily and she gave him a quick nod. They'd clearly been through this before. "Third, and this is important," Samuel's eyes moved to each crew member in turn, lingering on me for a moment longer than the others. "When the lightning flashes, don't look directly at it. Keep your eyes down or closed. If I tell you to close your eyes during a lightning strike, you do it immediately and keep them closed until I say otherwise." The rain was coming harder now, and I could hear the first rumbles of thunder in the distance. The boat pitched more sharply as larger waves began to reach us, and Samuel had to steady himself against the table. "Questions?" he asked. Nobody spoke. I had about a dozen questions. Why whisper? Why avoid looking at lightning? Why stay so close together? But Rule 6 kept my mouth shut. The crew's calm acceptance of instructions that made no sense told me everything I needed to know about how seriously I should take Samuel's orders. "Good," Samuel said. "James, you and Tyler take the stern. Riley and the Bakers, you're midship. I'll be in the wheelhouse. Remember, Whispers only, stay close. Eyes down during lightning. We ride this out together. We moved up to the deck as the storm arrived with the force of something that had been building energy for hours before reaching us. The wind hit like a physical blow, carrying rain that stung my face and made it hard to keep my eyes open. Within minutes, everything was soaked: clothes, deck, equipment, and the boat began the kind of rolling motion that made walking feel like a controlled fall. James grabbed my arm and leaned close to my ear. "Stay right here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Don't let go of the rail. Don't move unless I move." The lightning started about 20 minutes into the storm. Not the normal kind of lightning that illuminates clouds and disappears, but flashes that seem to originate from the water itself and climb upward into the sky. When the first one hit, James immediately put his hand on my shoulder and pushed my head down. "Eyes closed," he whispered urgently. "Don't look." I squeezed my eyes shut and felt the light flash through my eyelids, brighter than any lightning I'd ever experienced, bright enough that it felt like looking at the sun. But in the moment before James had pushed my head down, I'd caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop. There had been more people on deck. Not our crew. I could account for all of them. But additional figures standing near the wheelhouse, moving along the port rail, working with equipment that wasn't there when the light faded. They looked like crew members, wore the same kind of work clothes, and moved with the same practiced efficiency. But they appeared only in the lightning flashes and vanished the instant darkness returned. "James," I whispered, leaning close to his ear. "Did you see—" "Don't talk about it," he whispered back. "Just keep your eyes down and follow orders." Another lightning flash illuminated the deck, and this time I managed to keep my head down as James had instructed. But I could see the reflection of the light on the wet deck, and in that reflection, shadows moved in ways that didn't match the wind patterns. Ropes coiled and uncoiled themselves, equipment shifted position without anyone touching it, and shapes that were definitely too large to be human moved along the edges of the deck. The storm intensified over the next hour. Waves that should have been manageable for a boat the size of the Cassandra's Dream hit us with enough force to send spray clear over the wheelhouse. The wind howled with a sound that seemed to carry voices, not calling names like I'd heard before, but speaking in languages that didn't sound human. Samuel's voice cut through the noise from the wheelhouse, calling out course corrections that seemed to steer us away from certain areas of water. I noticed that whenever we changed direction, it was to avoid patches of ocean that glowed with a phosphorescent light that had nothing to do with normal bioluminescence. The glow pulsed with an almost deliberate rhythm, and in its illumination, I could see shapes moving beneath the surface that were far too large to be any kind of fish. "Everyone close your eyes," Samuel called out, his voice barely reaching us over the storm. "Lightning coming. Keep them closed until I say." I pressed my face against my arm and squeezed my eyes shut as tightly as possible. The flash that followed was so bright it seemed to penetrate straight through my skull, and with it came a sound that wasn't quite thunder. More like something massive breaking the surface of the water and crashing back down, but amplified to a volume that made the boat's hull vibrate like a struck bell. "Keep them closed," Samuel shouted. "Don't open them yet." I could hear things moving on deck, footsteps that were too heavy, equipment being dragged across metal surfaces, voices that whispered in that same inhuman language the wind carried. But when Samuel finally gave the all clear and I opened my eyes, the deck looked exactly as it had before the lightning strike. The storm continued through the night, with Samuel occasionally calling for us to close our eyes during certain flashes while allowing us to keep them open during others. I never figured out what determined the difference, but the crew followed his instructions without hesitation, and gradually I learned to trust his judgment about which lightning strikes were safe to witness and which ones weren't. Riley and the Baker siblings stayed huddled together midship, whispering occasionally to each other but mostly just enduring the storm in silence. I could see them in the brief moments when normal lightning illuminated the deck, and their faces showed the kind of calm concentration that came from people who'd been through this before and knew how to survive it. Around 3 in the morning, the wind began to die down. The lightning continued, but with less frequency, and the waves gradually returned to something approaching normal size. Samuel kept us all on deck until the last flashes had faded, and the only sound was the familiar rumble of the engine and the splash of water against the hull. When dawn finally came, it revealed an ocean that was unnaturally calm, not just peaceful, but mirror flat in a way that seemed impossible after the violence of the previous night. The sky was clear, with no trace of the storm clouds that had battered us for hours. Samuel emerged from the wheelhouse looking exhausted, but relieved. He moved among the crew, checking on each person and surveying the deck for damage. Remarkably, everything seemed to be exactly where it belonged, despite the chaos we'd endured. "Good work," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. Everyone did exactly what they needed to do. As the crew began the process of returning to normal operations, checking equipment, preparing breakfast, resuming fishing activities, nobody mentioned the additional figures we'd seen during lightning flashes, or the sounds of impossible movement on deck, or the glowing patches of water that Samuel had steered us away from. It was as if the storm had been perfectly ordinary, just another challenge of working on the ocean that required standard seamanship and careful navigation. But I caught the looks that passed between crew members, the way they moved a little closer to each other than usual, and the relief in their voices when they spoke. We'd made it through something that could have gone very differently, and everyone knew it. I waited until the crew had scattered across the deck before approaching Captain Samuel. He was checking compass readings near the wheelhouse, his weathered hands steady despite the exhaustion that showed in the lines around his eyes. The morning sun felt different after the storm, warmer, more real, like something we'd earned the right to experience again. "Captain," I said, keeping my voice low, "can I ask you something?" Samuel looked up from his instruments, studying my face with the same careful assessment he'd given me that first day on the dock. After a moment, he nodded and gestured toward the wheelhouse interior where we could talk without the others overhearing. Inside, the space felt smaller than usual with both of us standing there. Charts were spread across the navigation table marked with pencil lines that showed our route over the past few days. Samuel rolled one of them up and secured it with a rubber band before turning his attention back to me. "You've got questions," he said. It wasn't really a question. "I've been following the rules," I said, "but I don't understand what I'm following them for. What's out here, Captain? What are we dealing with?" Samuel moved to the small coffee pot and poured himself a cup, then offered me one. The coffee was strong and bitter, the kind that helped focus thoughts after a long night. He took a sip and looked out through the front windows at the unnaturally calm ocean. "The water's old," Samuel said finally. "Older than the continents, older than most of the life that crawled out of it, and some things never left." I waited for him to continue, holding my coffee cup with both hands to keep them steady. Most people who work on the ocean, commercial fishermen, cargo crews, research vessels, they stick to the shallow waters or the well-traveled shipping lanes, places where there's enough human activity to keep the old things at a distance. Samuel paused, rolling the coffee cup between his palms. "But boats like ours, we go farther out. We stay longer. We fish the deep waters where the old things have been waiting." Through the windows, I could see James and Riley working together to inspect the rigging. Their movements looked normal, but I noticed they stayed close to each other, maintaining the proximity that Samuel had insisted on during the storm. "The rules," Samuel continued, "they weren't written by marine biologists or safety inspectors. They were developed by captains who lost crew members to things that don't exist in any textbook. Trial and error over decades. Most of the errors cost lives." "How many?" I asked. "Too many." Samuel's voice carried the weight of personal experience. Good people who didn't know what they were dealing with, or who thought they could handle it differently. "The voice in the water that called your name? That was someone's daughter once. The bell that only you could hear. That's how they announce themselves before they take someone new. My coffee had gone cold, but I kept holding the cup anyway. The normalcy of the action helped ground me while Samuel explained things that challenged everything I thought I understood about the world. Last night's storm, Samuel said. That wasn't weather. That was something testing us, seeing if we knew how to respond appropriately. The lightning flashes that showed extra crew members, the voices in the wind, the glowing patches of water, all of it was designed to break our discipline, make us react wrong. What would have happened if we had? Samuel looked directly at me, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach tighten. Other boats have found empty lifeboats drifting in calm seas. No distress signals, no signs of struggle. Just empty boats with all the safety equipment still properly secured. I set my coffee cup down on the navigation table, processing what Samuel was telling me. The rules weren't just guidelines for dealing with unusual phenomena. They were survival protocols developed through the loss of entire crews. You did good last night, Samuel said. Following orders that didn't make sense, staying quiet when every instinct told you to call out warnings, keeping your eyes closed when you wanted to see what was happening. That kind of discipline probably saved all of us. The boat's engine shifted into a different rhythm, and through the wheelhouse windows I could see Kevin adjusting our heading. We were turning east, toward the distant line of the Oregon coast. "We're heading back?" I asked. 2-week rotation's almost done, Samuel confirmed. Time to restock, give the crew some shore leave, make repairs. I followed Samuel back out onto the deck where the others were wrapping up their equipment checks. The atmosphere felt different than it had during my first few days aboard. James looked up as I approached, and instead of the polite distance he'd maintained before, he gave me a nod that carried real acknowledgement. "Good work last night," James said quietly, coiling a section of rope with practiced efficiency. "Takes guts to follow orders you don't understand." Riley appeared beside us, carrying a toolkit that she'd been using to inspect the winch mechanisms. "You know what it means now," she said, not bothering with small talk or pleasantries. "What the rules are really for." I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady if I tried to speak. "Had a crew member once," Riley continued, her hands never stopping their work with the tools. "Young guy, maybe a year older than you. Smart, eager to learn, good worker, but he thought he could improve on the rules. Figured he understood the situation better than the captains who'd written them." James finished coiling his rope and secured it to the deck cleat, but he didn't move away. The three of us stood there while Riley continued her story, and I realized this was the first time any of the veteran crew had shared details about their previous experiences. Second night out, he heard the voice calling from the water, but instead of ignoring it like Rule 1 says, he decided to throw a life preserver, thought he was being helpful. Riley's voice stayed matter-of-fact, but I could see tension in the way she gripped her wrench. We found his bunk empty the next morning, safety harness still hanging in his locker, life jacket still in its storage compartment, like he'd just decided to take a swim in the middle of the night. "The thing calling from the water," James added, "it used his voice for the rest of that trip. Same accent, same speech patterns, calling out to each of us by name." I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The idea that something could take a person and then use their voice to lure others made every supernatural encounter I'd experienced seem even more threatening. Kevin and Emily approached us, carrying equipment they'd finished inspecting. Instead of moving past to store it below deck, they stopped and joined our informal circle. Emily set down her gear and looked directly at me. "You're different now," Emily said. "I can see it in how you carry yourself. You understand what we're up against." "It's not just about following rules anymore," Kevin added. "It's about understanding that the rules exist because people like us figured out how to survive things that shouldn't be survivable." The sun was climbing higher, and I could see the Oregon coastline becoming more distinct on the eastern horizon. We'd be back in Portland within hours, back to the normal world where people worried about traffic and bills and whether their favorite restaurant was still open, but I realized I wasn't the same person who'd answered that Craigslist ad a week ago. The Tyler who'd carried his duffel bag down Pier 7 had been looking for temporary work and a chance to get away from his problems. The person I was now understood that some problems couldn't be escaped because they weren't personal. They were fundamental aspects of a world that was far stranger and more dangerous than most people ever suspected. James started gathering equipment, and the others followed his lead. The normal routine of preparing for port was beginning, but I noticed the way they included me in their movements now. When Emily headed below deck to organize supplies, she asked if I wanted to help. When Kevin began securing loose items, he handed me a checklist and expected me to know what needed to be done. "You thinking about signing on for another rotation?" Riley asked, as we worked together to cover the sorting station. I looked out at the approaching coastline, then back at the crew who had become something more than co-workers over the past 2 weeks. James was showing me how to properly secure the tarp we were using, his instructions patient and thorough. Kevin and Emily were discussing maintenance tasks that would need to be completed during our time in port, including me in their planning like it was obvious I'd be there to help. These people had trusted me with their lives during situations that could have killed all of us. They'd shared knowledge that most of the world didn't know existed, and they'd watched me prove that I could handle responsibilities that went far beyond normal crew duties. "Yeah," I said, surprised by how certain I felt about the decision. "I'm signing on again." Riley smiled, the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from her since that first day. "Good. We can use someone who learns fast." The Portland skyline was visible now, familiar buildings that marked the return to civilization. But I wasn't returning to the same life I'd left behind. I was coming back as someone who understood that the ocean held predators that marine biologists had never cataloged, and that there were people whose job it was to protect others from encounters with things that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. Captain Samuel joined us on deck as we approached the harbor, checking our progress and making small adjustments to our course. When he looked at me, I saw approval in his expression, not just for following orders, but for choosing to take on the responsibility that came with the knowledge he'd shared. The Cassandra's dream cut through the calm water toward Pier 7, carrying a crew that had faced the ocean's deepest mysteries and brought everyone home safe. As we prepared to dock, I understood that I wasn't just returning from a fishing trip. I was coming back from an initiation into something that most people would never comprehend, and I was ready to go back out again.